Chicago has a large native Hispanic population, representing about 20% of the city, including Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Ecuadorians, Colombians, and so on, with some of these groups having ethnic enclaves in the city rich in the type of history and culture that makes the United States a melting pot. And I might be biased, but in my opinion, Chicago also has the best Mexican food outside of Texas. But recently, of course, in Chicago, many members of the Hispanic community have been protesting the actions of ICE, as of course, in addition to arresting illegal immigrants, they've also arrested several US citizens believing them to be illegals, including a teenager in Miami who was on his way to work. And while there have been extreme demonstrations, some of the protests by the Hispanic community have been peaceful in the city. But a subset of gang members, specifically the Latin Kings, have been accused of setting a $10,000 bounty for anyone who would kill the chief of Border Patrol who had recently been stationed in Chicago. And while this might not seem significant, as I said before, organized gangs are a thing of the past in the city. Even the Latino gangs are now just hoods made up of Latin Kings, SDs, Spanish Cobras, Maniacs, all of which would have been enemies in the past, but with the loose structure we have now, the gang doesn't really matter. If you're from the same area, you get along, and have even taken a common loss, then you can all be in the same gang. That being said, putting money on someone's head is not as common as you might think. Many times when a known gang member dies, people take to the internet and make unsubstantiated claims about some kind of bounty being collected, because it makes for a better headline and story than the actual truth, which is, in many cases, just a spur-of-the-moment action. Such as when a well-known Chicago rapper and member of the STL clique FBG Duck was murdered in such a wealthy and affluent part of the city that many people assumed that he had to have $100,000 on his head for something like this to take place, when in reality, it was just that while Duck was downtown shopping, a guy who was jealous about Duck's former relationship with the mother of his child called and lied to members of the O-Block gang, saying they needed to come save him since FBG Duck had just chased him with a gun, and this led to Duck's murder, despite the fact that he had done no such thing and he likely didn't even notice the guy making the call because Duck was only downtown to buy his son a birthday present. And the Latin King's bounty on the Border Patrol chief was best described by a former lieutenant in the Chicago police when he said,
"You've got gang members that are doing drive-bys on the weekends for free. So offer $10,000 and you might actually get one of these knuckleheads that would take them up on it."
And I want to make it clear, unlike the South Side, hustling is still alive and well on the west side of the city, where most of the Hispanic gangs call home. So unlike the more renegade gangs in the city, these guys are making money, and of course, some of them even had connections with the cartel, as it has been forever in Chicago. The Hispanic gangs will be the closest to what you could call organized, with some sets of the Latin Kings specifically being in the same area Al Capone and the Chicago outfit once owned property in.
With the mobsters and shit. Like that's when that shit started, like after Capone and shit, because he got some cribs right here.
But this whole murder for hire case alleged by the FBI is disputed, as it may not even be true. The FBI called him a high-ranking gang member and sometimes leader of the Latin Kings, but federal law enforcement has been shown many times in the past to have very little understanding of how gangs actually work. As back in 2020, the DOJ claimed to have arrested the leader of the Black Disciples, which if you know anything about the streets in Chicago, you'll know that the Black Disciples haven't had a leader in over 20 years. In fact, there are Black Disciple cliques at war with each other as I speak, and the DEA claimed to have arrested a high-level member of the Four Corner Hustlers in 2023, with this guy just being a man nearly 60 years old, who was likely just a big-time drug dealer, probably having very little influence over the teenagers actually waging wars. Now, the family of the man arrested for the alleged bounty on the Border Patrol chief, Juan Espinoza Martinez, says that the claims about him are false. And while normally I would ignore the words of the family since they can usually be biased, I have to admit that when it comes to gangs in Chicago specifically, the local police are the only ones who actually understand what's going on. The feds specialize in racketeering cases and grouping people together as if they're one and the same, but like I said earlier, most neighborhoods in the city with gang members are not homogenous. The days of one single gang being together on a block are long gone in Chicago, and in my opinion, if it was so easy to prove a guy in Chicago to be a gang leader, then we should be seeing racketeering cases from the FBI in the city each year, but we might get one every 2 years. That's kind of misleading. Unlike the huge gang roundups you see in New York City, which are actually headed by the NYPD because it's their city, so they understand exactly how the gangs work, with many of them being raised around these same neighborhoods as kids. Now, the case is ongoing, but so far, the only evidence I've seen presented by the government are Snapchat messages from an account named Juan, where $2,000 is offered for information and $10,000 to take the Border Patrol chief down. And this screenshot is said to have come from a confidential informant, And there are several informants in every hood. And if this is all true, that means the sender sent this message to someone he trusted. And if you don't know, the Latin Kings, 2-6, Cobras, all of them, these boys get busy. They get so busy that gang members on the south side usually try to avoid going to places like Humble Park, Little Village, Gage Park, and all of those neighborhoods, as it can definitely get dangerous for you even if you have no ops. Back when I was in high school, it was a well-known fact that the Latino gangs just banged way harder than everybody else. Like, you might see somebody on the south side throwing up gang signs, but the Latinos out west, they was throwing up the whole star, coming to their ops block and taking street signs down. And that's still happening to this day. But of course, I'm oversimplifying because there's a lot less organization now. But just from my personal experience as somebody from the south side, I never played crazy over there. I remember in 2024, a woman posted the address of her child's father on Facebook, mocking his ops by calling them weak for not doing anything to him. And clearly this was done out of anger, but the next day, he was dead on the same block as his house, likely being caught on his own front porch. And I assume the only reason she wasn't charged is because this is not really a murder for hire or conspiracy, because she just simply posted his address, and that was only fatal because he did have ops. But did Juan Espinosa Martinez really do something that's incriminating, sending evidence of a murder for hire on Snapchat? And does he really control a subset of guys that would have done it? The Latin Kings in general have a long history in Chicago, and they are probably the most well-known Hispanic gang in the Midwest. And back in the day, they were so serious that they created their own manifesto following a belief system known as Kingism, and they started to take over parts of the city after the Division Street riots in 1966, which happened during the first ever Puerto Rican Day parade in Chicago, when a Puerto Rican man was gunned down by Chicago police, and is widely thought to have been unjust, as some accused the police of falsely claiming that the man, a 22-year-old, was armed. And it's also disputed whether the Latin Kings were founded by a man named King Phil or Ramon Santos. Now, if a bounty was placed on the head of a high-ranking member of Border Patrol, I would think that only a cartel would have enough resources and authority to do something like that, at least as a part of a gang, as the Department of Justice describes it. And it just so happens, the Latin Kings had a history with the Sinaloa cartel specifically. The Flores twins, while I'm not sure what gang they were associated with because they were mostly known to be connected directly to the Sinaloa, allegedly taking trips to Mexico for drug runs as children at 7 years old, their older brother was said to be a shot caller in the Latin Kings at the time. But one of the Flores twins was cross-examined during the case that he ended up testifying against El Chapo in, when El Chapo's lawyer tried to tie Flores to the murder of Rudy Rangel, also known as King Cato. Cato was a Latin king and one of the biggest drug dealers in the city at the time of his death, and also despite being in Chicago, he was a close friend of DMX. The lawyer even alleged that after Cato died, his wife married one of the Flores twins. But these ties are over 20 years old, and just because there once was a connection doesn't mean one still exists, at least not with the gang as a whole. It is possible that a clique exists with some kind of connection to a cartel, but it seems far-fetched. If a man did send this message, it could have just been out of a personal vendetta and not an objective of the gang as a whole. This could very well just be one man independently attempting to facilitate a murder for hire. But the retired police lieutenant said exactly what I thought when I first read it. It's just not as common as people think for a bounty to actually be placed by a gang member. It happens, but there are more people shooting for free than paid hitmen. And although I've constantly referred to Hispanic gangs, it's important to note that many hoods like the insane 2-2 boys in Little Village are mixed, more of a reflection of the times, whereas most gangs were started out of anger and fear due to oppression from other groups in the 1960s, but with the civil rights era past and all of these gangs still existing, of course they would eventually mix. And I believe this started with the white gang, the Almighty Gaylords. These guys were originally sort of an actual white supremacist gang, but over time they just slowly evolved after there were internal splits and accepted other races. The Simon City Royals were literally another version of the Aryan Nation before mixing, and of course every now and then you'll see some black Latin kings, who despite the name have no Latin heritage. And of course there are also black Mexicans, black Puerto Ricans, and so on. And also in the area around Midway Airport, there are a mix of Hispanic and black cliques in the area, with some of the 2-6 gang being on 63rd. Now of course 63rd is a block made famous by rappers from the south side, but this is a completely different part of 63rd Street. A street that is very, very long, as the 63rd and 64th that STL and O Block sit on is about 10 to 15 miles away, as 63rd stretches from Lake Michigan to the suburbs, basically in a straight line across the entire city east to west. The Gangster 2-6 gang, as they were originally known, started as a baseball team supposedly, whose members just fell into the streets in the late 60s and early 70s. And although every clique is not the same, some of them have been into it with the Latin Kings since their founder, David Ayala, was convicted of murdering 2 Latin Kings in the 80s. Although David was actually released released from prison after the Bonjean Law Group out of New York City proved that he was wrongfully convicted of the murders. And they also got his cousin Jimmy Soto out of prison for a wrongful conviction the same year. Incidentally, the two cousins were the longest serving wrongfully convicted people in Illinois. The Satan Disciples are a gang originally started by immigrants from Eastern Europe, like Czechoslovakia when that was still a thing, and of course from Poland. And they have a pretty evil sounding name. As a kid, I used to think they worshiped the devil or something, but it turns out they got their name when a priest doing community outreach in the neighborhood called some of the guys in the area Devil's Disciples, which means they probably did something to offend this priest, which gave the younger guys under them the idea to call themselves the Satan Disciples. But the Devil's Disciples are not to be confused with the motorcycle club of the same name that originated in California. But like many gangs, the SDs eventually mixed and became a mostly Hispanic gang. And all of these gangs are broken up into several cliques from West Lawn and Gage Park all the way up to Cicero. Now, what little organization there is probably there because there's a strong semblance of community in the Hispanic enclaves of Chicago. During the riots and looting of 2020, many in certain Hispanic neighborhoods came together to deter looters from destroying their community, making a real effort towards saving the community, kind of like the violence interrupters in the black neighborhoods on the south side. And since this part of Chicago is largely unexplored on the internet, obviously this could be an hour-long video, but I don't just want to highlight the negative side of this part of the city because, as I said earlier, it's rich in culture and history. And it's part of what I love about Chicago. And this mix of culture is what gives the city its identity, beyond all the crime and the negative stuff you see in the media. Because within these communities, there are hard-working families. Many military service members also come from the Hispanic community. And definitely come eat food in Chicago. If you guys want a part 2 on this, and we can keep going deeper into the history of the city, just let me know.